Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
the office of President of the United States.
Our social and political progress has been based on one fundamental principle: the value and importance of the individual.
There's a new mood in America.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
Let us learn together and laugh together and work together.
We must accommodate changing times in which we are involved right this moment, but we must cling to principles that never change. I didn't ask God to let me live, but I just asked God to give me a proper attitude toward death. And I found that I was absolutely and completely at ease with death. You know, I've had a wonderful life. I've had thousands of friends, and I've had an exciting and adventurous and gratifying existence.
The great principles that have guided this nation since its very founding will continue to guide America through the challenges of the future. I've wanted to serve as president because I love this country and because I love the people of this nation.
The nation and the world continues paying its final tribute of respects to the nation's 39th president, James Earl Carter Jr., who died December 29th, 2024, and the series of events in coordinates and in conjunction with President Carter's state funeral continue throughout the United States, and we are continuing to cover all of these events here at Atlanta News First and at atlantanewsfirst.com. I'm Tim Darnell, and we're happy to be joined today by Alain Sanders. He is a former Time Magazine senior reporter and currently a professor emeritus at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, New Jersey. And Alan, we were talking before and we went on the air talking about the former president's legacy. Yeah, his administration took office at a time when the economy was in serious trouble. We had inflation. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries had begun to cut back production a few years earlier in 1973 during Richard Nixon's administration, and those cutbacks really began inflicting a lot of pain on Americans at the pump. At the same time, we're in a serious nuclear arms race discussion with the Soviet Union. Jimmy Carter becoming the 39th president of the United States, being the first president, and Rosalynn Carter, First Lady, to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue after the inauguration. He really inherited a volatile situation when he assumed office in January 1977.
Yes, absolutely. It was a volatile situation. Of course, we were just coming off the Watergate scandal as well. And so there was a moral and legal crisis in the country that had festered for years. And he came to office trying to heal the country and bring it back together. And then, of course, as you point out, there were all these turbulent events overseas as well. So it was a difficult time. And then, of course, the economy was also highly problematic at the time as well.
In terms of the domestic situation, we had inflation, we had oil shortages. What are some of the other challenges President Carter faced domestically?
Well, I think on the international scene, there were a lot of challenges. I mean, Russia was aggressive as it always was. There was protest in Panama regarding the Panama Canal, a huge protest asking the United States to give the canal back. And of course, Carter ultimately negotiated the treaty that did give the canal back to Panama. And so that was a major achievement, though it was as a result of a lot of turmoil there and, of course, in Latin America about American colonialism and so forth. But I think the biggest crisis that Carter faced was the Iranian hostage crisis. It was triggered by the fact that Carter admitted the Shah of Iran for medical treatment in the United States. That angered the Islamic revolutionary regime there, and it led to the assault of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the taking of 52 American diplomats as hostages. And that crisis lasted 444 days. And that dominated the news. It dominated the administration's work day to day. And I think it was a major contributor to the defeat of Carter for re-election.
But the hostages were released eventually, but just not under President Carter's watch.
Right. They were released as a result of his negotiation. He sent his Deputy Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, to negotiate a deal. He went to Algeria, if I recall correctly, to negotiate a deal with the Iranian government. And ultimately, he did reach an agreement. But out of spite, the Iranian regime did not actually release the hostages until Ronald Reagan became president. They actually released the hostages within hours of Reagan's assumption of the presidency, although, again, the release was negotiated by Carter. What's interesting, however, is that Reagan, being the magnanimous person that he was, agreed to allow Carter, as a private citizen, to go overseas to greet the hostages as they were released. I believe he went to Germany. The hostages went to Germany to be assessed and treated medically for any problems they might have had. And Reagan agreed that the greeting person there in Germany for the hostages should be former President Carter.
With President Carter's reputation around the world as being a humanitarian, someone who is so focused on human rights, equal rights, why do you think the Iranian government was so hostile to him during his administration?
Well, I think they were hostile because they wanted the overthrow of the Shah, which they achieved, and they were very angry at the Shah. They believed that the Shah represented a colonial regime that was supported by the West, by the United States, and by Great Britain. And by admitting the Shah for medical treatment, that just angered the regime beyond measure. Public sentiment let loose. The Iranian regime allowed it to let loose. It resulted in the assault of the American embassy. That was one of the tragedies during the Carter era. Carter focused on that. He believed that because he was a humanitarian, that he should focus on the release of the hostages. Another president might have said, okay, we have a crisis there, and he might have minimized it and tried to turn public attention to other aspects of the presidency and to other issues that the United States faced. That's often the case. When something bad happens, you try to move on and focus on something else. But Carter, being the humanitarian that he was, believed that this was one of the prime responsibilities of his time in office. And he devoted a lot of time, focused a lot of attention on it, because he believed that it was important to release those people. But of course, by focusing on it, he attracted more media coverage and more criticism. And as I said, it contributed significantly to his defeat for re-election.
Circling back to something that you had mentioned earlier, the Panama Canal. And I bring it up because we're all aware of President-elect Trump's claims that or threats that he's going to, the U.S. will take back the Panama Canal. Why did President Carter negotiate the return of the canal? If I recall, Panama was under a military dictatorship at the time. General Omar Torrijos was kind of a strongman dictator, engineered the military takeover of the government. Why did President Carter negotiate the return of that canal?
Well, we tend to forget that this time of world history really was an anti-colonialist period. That is to say, a lot of countries had recently gained their independence. There was an anti-colonialist backlash around the world, in Latin America as well. And so I think Carter believed that to move forward, to move on, and to achieve better relations, not just with Panama, but with all Latin American countries, it was important to shed the colonialist symbol, if you will, of the Panama Canal in Central America. And so he negotiated that really in an attempt to enhance and increase world peace and democracy. That is to say, to show that the forces of democracy, led by the United States, were well aware of the colonialist past, and they were willing to renegotiate what many people thought was an unfair treaty and give the canal, as a result, that had been owned by the United States as a result of that treaty, give the canal back and create a new treaty in which Panama would assume full control of the canal area.
The other foreign policy challenge that we haven't spoken about yet is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that happened during President Carter's watch. I remember it. I remember how dramatic it was. It seems that the only symbolic response, or really the highest profile response the United States took, was to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Were there any other, could President Carter have done anything else in response to that Soviet invasion?
Well, I think there may have been surreptitious aid to the rebels in Afghanistan that opposed the Soviet invasion, but essentially, I think the assessment was that the Soviet Union was moving into a quagmire in Afghanistan. Let's remember that we had just recently left Vietnam, which had been a quagmire for the United States for many years. And so I think the feeling in the Carter administration is that the Soviet Union hadn't learned anything as a result of America's quagmire and was about to enter into its own quagmire. And as it turned out, that was really true. The Soviet Union was essentially defeated and kicked out of Afghanistan. And so doing nothing or almost nothing over Afghanistan was probably the right policy, and it achieved the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from that area.
We're all familiar with what happened, excuse me, during the 1980 election. California Governor Ronald Reagan defeated Carter in a landslide. By then, the president had already faced down a challenge from within his own party, from U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy. Do you believe it's almost unheard of for an incumbent president who is running for re-election to face a challenger from within his own party? Do you think that weakened Carter politically?
Yes, I think so. Clearly, the emergence of Senator Kennedy as a rival indicated that there was wide dissatisfaction with Carter, in large measure because of the economy. I think that's primarily why Kennedy ran against him. And because of that, Kennedy, challenged seriously President Carter, and Carter had to win, the nomination by a fight. It wasn't the same thing, but it echoed the challenges that Lyndon Johnson faced when he presumably was seeking his first elected term, or a second elected term, I should say. And there was much dissent in the Democratic Party then. There were primaries against Lyndon Johnson. Ultimately, Johnson decided to withdraw. Now, Carter did not decide to withdraw. But again, when you challenge an incumbent president, the lessons from Johnson and the lessons from Carter are that that weakens the incumbent tremendously. And the opposition party capitalizes on that and goes on to win the general election.
Which is what happened. Ronald Reagan would carry 48 states to Carter and Vice President Mondale's 2 of Georgia and Minnesota. 4 years later, Reagan would also just absolutely demolish Walter Mondale, 49 states to 1. Those are really the last 2 overwhelming landslides we've seen in the American electoral system. Jimmy Carter returns from Europe after welcoming the 52 American hostages home, returns to Georgia, and then begins what is, by all accounts, a post-presidency unmatched in American history. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, that was unprecedented. What he did as a former president, his post-presidency is unprecedented, remains unprecedented. Carter decided to devote and use his prestige to improve human rights and to improve peace around the world. He decided not to use it, his post-presidency, as a celebrity kind of status to sort of, ceremonially and be a celebrity and go around the world. A big lesson for his successors, by the way. Instead, he established the Carter Center, and the Carter Center was devoted to increase peace around the world by monitoring elections around the world. I think the Carter Center, and some of it was done by Carter personally, monitored something like 110 elections around the world to assure that they were fair and democratic. He also mediated disputes and agreements around the world in Ethiopia, in Sudan, even mediated some disagreements in North Korea. And then, of course, he was instrumental in using the Carter Center to make it a major force to eradicate diseases around the world. And he was a big health advocate, and he worked very hard to eradicate diseases in Africa and in other parts of the world. And then let's not forget also that aside from the actual work of the Carter Center, which was phenomenal, um, Jimmy Carter, on his own as a volunteer, joined Habitat for Humanity and personally helped build houses for low-income families. And he was seeing, nailing things together to help people have an affordable house, affordable lodging. And so not only did he use his prestige to create a center for peace and eradicating diseases and fair elections, but he also, with his bare hands, helped people achieve some sort of dignity by having low-income housing made available to them. So this was a phenomenal thing that had never occurred before, former president actually being a citizen of the world. And as a result of that, he got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. That's really why he earned the prize, not so much because of what he achieved as president, but because of what he achieved as a private citizen, using the former president's prestige in office to achieve humanitarian well-being. And as a result, he is a Nobel Peace Laureate and a well-deserved one.
Why don't more ex-presidents follow his example? I know that's an unfair question and it's totally ambiguous, but why don't we see more of our nation's former chief executives become citizens of the world, as you just said?
Well, of course, it's hard to know. You'd have to understand what goes through their minds. And of course, we can't do that. But one thing we can say is that although Carter was a determined person, he was a very strong-willed person, very determined person, at bottom, he was really a very humble man. He was a person of deep faith, believed in human dignity. He himself was humble. He lived in Plains, Georgia all his life, not just prior to the presidency, but after the presidency. And so that was in his being to be humble and to use what resources you had to help other fellow human beings. He was a Sunday school teacher before, and I think even during, but certainly after his presidency. And so that was part of his being. The other element is he wasn't drinking the prestige of the presidency. Once you're president, you have everybody around you standing up when you walk into a room and saying, Mr. President, and there's pomp and circumstance and music and all kinds of ceremonial trappings that many people get stuck on. Once they achieve the presidency and in the post-presidency, they kind of want that honor to reside and think that they're very important people. Of course, they are. But Carter never let that get to his head. He realized he was very important. That's why he did all the humanitarian work. But he never let his importance go to his head. And that's what distinguishes him as a very special person and as a very special former president.
Would we be remembering President Carter as fondly today had it not been for his historic, unprecedented post-presidential activities?
Yeah, I think that is a major part of his legacy. And I think, it's very hard for a president, any president, to stand out in history. We might be able to remember maybe 10 presidents. Historians usually like to list the top 10 presidents, but most presidents really lie forgotten in the records of history, largely because the job of a chief executive, unless you're facing a major crisis, the job of a chief executive is really just to keep the government running. It's sort of a routine kind of job. And so most presidents do that, some better than others. But unless there's a major crisis or major event that defines the presidency, usually presidents are forgotten. But by having this major set of events dominate Carter's post-presidency, I think he will be remembered for that because that's something that didn't happen before him and has really not happened since he left the presidency. So that will certainly mark his term as president, being the best former president the United States ever had.
That's certainly unquestionable that as far as that goes. His post-presidency was unprecedented in world history, truly. We are wrapping up our conversation with Alain Sanders, who is a professor emeritus at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, former Time Magazine senior reporter. As we continue and as the nation continues to pay tribute and pay its final farewells to the 39th President of the United States, Alain Sanders' final thoughts on Jimmy Carter's legacy. Leave us with your final analysis of the man, the presidency, his presidency, and his place in history.
Well, I think if you look at the man, if you look at his presidency, and if you look at his post-presidency, I think the one word that defines all three of those periods in his life is decency. Jimmy Carter was a decent man. He was a man of faith. He believed in humanitarian aid, in the the commonality of all humanity. And most importantly, he was a decent person. He respected everyone, even those who opposed him. And he believed that his role on earth was to make the United States and the world a more decent place, a more civilized place, a more peaceful place. So I think the word decency is what defines his life, and what I think will be remembered most by those who knew him and by those who look into his record as president and former president.
Atlanta News First will continue to cover the life and legacy of Georgia's favorite son, the 39th President of the United States, James Earl Carter. Thanks to Alain Sanders, Professor Emeritus at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, and himself a former Time Magazine senior reporter. I'm Tim Darnell from Atlanta News First. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening. You can listen to all of our podcasts on your favorite podcasting platform, be it YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to and download your podcast. Thanks again for joining us.